This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 336. How does liquidity impact the economy?
Government budgets don't work like household budgets.
The assumption is that an independent central bank will raise interest rates in order to attract money into the country to finance the budget deficit.
You buy long-term securities, you drive up their price, you drive down their yield.
My colleagues and I are acutely aware that high inflation imposes significant hardship.
And what I want to do is different.
This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
Well, this week we look at liquidity, having enough cash to get by, whether you're a business trying to manage your cash flow or a bank wanting to make sure that there's not a run on your money that could see you go to the wall. What is the role of liquidity in the economy, and can downturns happen when there's too much or not enough liquidity? Is this something that economists don't pay enough attention to? That's today on the Debunking Economics Podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. Welcome along. Now, if you run a business, however small it is, you'll know all about cash flow. In fact, the smaller the business, the more you'll know about it. I mean, your business might be profitable, but can you get through the periods when income is down? Like Christmas, for example, quickly followed in the UK by the January deadline for tax payments. You can tell I'm talking about a personal experience here. This year has not been so bad, but some years, I mean, it's a shocker. You might have a profitable business, but do you have the liquidity to get through? Well, banks, of course, face liquidity questions as well. Do they have the cash if there's going to be a run on the bank, or do they have the reserves to settle interbank transfers? We want to look at all of that today. But the bigger question is, what does the level of liquidity do to the economy? If we're all holding cash as a buffer and not spending it, does that mean we're holding the economy back? And what if we invest in less liquid assets? Is it helping the economy, or is it just propping up the finance sector? So liquidity today. So Steve, I want to start with a man. I know you're not a particular fan of his, and I can understand, some of the differences. I think there's some commonality as well in that you're both reasonably progressive economists. You probably know who I'm talking about, Paul Krugman.
Oh dear. Okay, yeah.
In his book, End This Depression Now, I do like this, and it's worth talking about. He refers to, not his article, a 1977 article in the Journal of Money, Credit and Banking about the Great Capitol Hill babysitting co-op.
Oh, God, okay. Yes, I remember this one. Mm-hmm.
They issued 20 coupons. This is vividly worked in on Capitol Hill, and basically they needed babysitters. So they'd babysit for each other. The couples would babysit for each other. And they issued 20 coupons to each person, and each one was half an hour of babysitting time. So you'd basically exchange the coupons, in exchange for that babysitting. The problem was some people used them more than others. And then when some of them got low on coupons, they didn't want to spend them. They became reluctant to go out, which meant, of course, that there was less babysitting opportunities for everybody else. And so the whole thing dried up just because of the balance of the coupons. So what they did was, because it wasn't, and if you look at it in the terms of, that as a microeconomy, the economy has basically slowed down, not through a lack of productive capacity, but because some people were, in effect, hoarding coupons. They were getting them and not using them, and others didn't want to use theirs because they didn't have enough. So that is a liquidity problem, isn't it?
It's a form of a liquidity problem, and it's usual. All his stuff leaves out the existence of banks, debt, and money, and it's all about interpersonal transactions and so on. But the fundamental point going on there is that people, it is not just the number of tokens that exist; it's how frequently those tokens turn over that's related to the income of the entire system, whether that's an economy or the babysitting co-op here. So you actually start with a presumption where you relate the number of tokens to the amount of economic activity you think is going to take place. Now, if you then find that when people find, well, I'm running low on tokens, then one way to cope with that is to, as you say, go out less. So what happens is the velocity of circulation of tokens falls, and that's what they realised in that toy economy model.
And the answer to that was that they just issued more coupons. I mean, so that all of a sudden that problem went away. no one got any richer as a result of having more coupons. Each coupon was still the cost of babysitting, so it didn't have an inflationary impact, but it did solve that liquidity issue.
And this. I mean, I wish I could send this part of the conversation to Elon Musk, because that's the key issue here is the turnover, and the creation of money solved the problem. You didn't have enough. The government, quote unquote, in that particular toy model, creates more tokens. Therefore, the rate of people don't feel the same pressure of a small number of tokens and spend more freely at the level they were doing before the system came in, and you get a recovery. And so the government running a deficit, fundamentally in that particular case, creates debt-free money for the rest of the people who then spend, and you go back to a normal velocity of money. So I think it is an apt example, but it leaves out the most important element, of course, that what makes people spend less rapidly is a high level of financial commitment. They think they have to meet their obligations. So you want to avoid bankruptcy. You want to avoid having creditors chasing after you. So your most important thing in some ways is to cover the financial claims on you before you do your spending. And then if you find that, if you're worried about meeting those financial claims, you do less spending. But that doesn't affect the number of tokens in existence. So what you get is a decline in the economy instead. And this is the classic paradox of thrift.
Yeah, and of course it is overly simple because it is just one commodity as well that we're talking about. It's babysitting. So if you gave people those tokens and they could spend it on anything, if you gave them that money, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to spend it on babysitting. They might spend it on other stuff, and that issue about that particular sector doesn't go away, does it? But it's so. How important then is liquidity generally? It is another word, isn't it, for just not having enough cash, basically. Well,
it's saying your financial commitments. If you're illiquid, your financial commitments on a daily basis exceed your cash flow on a daily basis. You can still be asset positive in the fact that your actual assets exceed your liabilities, so you're not insolvent or you're not negative equity, which is a point I want to distinguish regularly, because there's some inevitability in negative equity in a monetary economy for some parts of the system. You have if you can't meet your commitments as and when they fall due, you have illiquidity. If your liabilities exceed your assets and you therefore can't meet your short-term debt obligation, then you're insolvent. So they are key issues that only turn up in a monetary economy, which, of course, in the engineered model of the economy, which is monetary, to be able to understand this stuff. And guess who doesn't have that model? Paul Krugman and all the bloody neoclassicals.
That's why it was just a simple example, therefore, because he didn't want it to get too complicated. Because
I didn't want to talk about the real world. I mean, that's not a planet, according to these guys. That's what I find so frustrating.
But Paul Krugman is quite progressive, though. That's why,
he's politically progressive, but this is the same thing that John Hicks did back in the 1930s. He occupies the space that a more sensible analysis could occupy. He's the left side of the neoclassical envelope, and you don't want to meet the right-hand side of the envelope. So what actually happens is a nice progressive, politically okay, bloke with a beard, etc., is the public face of neoclassical economics. The beating heart of neoclassical economics is a bunch of right-wing turds that make the Koch brothers look socially acceptable, and in terms of their views. I'm not saying that they're bad people in that sense, but the Thomas Sargent, the Lucases, all this mob have a completely their vision of humanity wouldn't even suit solitary predators on the Serengeti plains. It's a totally.
Come on, tell us what you think. So let's look at. I want to come back and talk about there's different types. Obviously, different sectors within the economy where liquidity is important. And I talked about my own personal experiences going through a dry month of January for cash flow, because most of my businesses aren't. Most of my customers aren't paying me anything to do anything in January, mainly because I'd rather spend the time on the beach. So I can't blame them. But bank liquidity is an interesting one, isn't it? Which is And I guess there's two sides to this, isn't there? First of all, have they got enough reserves to be able to manage their interbank transfers? And have they got enough capital if there's a run on the bank? So if we look at those babysitting vouchers sitting in reserves, I can sort of see a comparison there. I might have got this wrong, but between central banks and the amount of reserves. So if you imagine those coupons are actually for interbank transfers rather than for babysitting, if there's not enough of them sitting in the various reserves of banks, sitting in the central bank accounts for those interbank settlements to happen, then the logical thing would be for the central bank to say, well, okay, let's just issue more reserves so that we can keep the system flowing. Is that a fair analysis, a fair comparison?
It's a reasonable analogy, and it comes down to what is the function of money. And in this particular case, because we're talking about this, effectively a central bank model, the ultimate responsibility of central banks is to maintain the solvency of the system. And what you had in that particular case, and also, it's also related to the rate of, they have objectives imposed on them in terms of the rate of inflation, the rate of unemployment, and so on. But the fundamental one is to make sure the financial system works. Now, if you have hoarding in that case, it doesn't necessarily mean the system won't work. It just produces less GDP, quote unquote, in that babysitting example. But fundamentally, you have a central bank that wants to make sure that banks don't fail at a systemic level. You can have failures at an individual level, and there are lots of those in America, which has an enormous number of banks. And the regulating authorities are always announcing the shutdown of a bank, the move of its depositors to another bank, some consolidation process, etc., at 4:30 on a Friday afternoon. So it doesn't get into the news cycle. And the depositors who in the bank that has gone insolvent wake up the next Monday and find that they have a bank account exactly the same numbers at a new bank. So that process of individual, letting some individual banks fail, but making sure that doesn't hit the depositors, that's a major necessary role for the central bank to maintain a functioning payment system.
But just going back to that analogy where, we've got hoarding going on, that could also be a bank that's so much bigger than all the other banks, couldn't it? So if you had one bank which has big reserves, so it's able to, it's not concerned at all about interbank settlements because it's got loads of cash, basically. So it can loan out a lot of money to people and not worry about that money going, some of that being needed for interbank settlements because it's got loads of cash to be able to manage that. Smaller banks will have a problem with that, won't they? Because they won't have as much money to sort out as for settlements. They'll have less in reserve. So they're operating as a.
I think we're getting quite a bit in the reserves are important, but I think you really have to think in a more realistic form about what bank balance sheets look like. And the primary responsibility of a bank is to have positive equity. Okay, that is okay.
Which is a separate thing, though. I'm just talking about because we do get central banks stepping in, don't we? When if there's not enough liquidity in bank transfers, they will do what has happened with that scheme, where they'll just put in more for a period.
And then that's again like back to the babysitter example. That's the internal co-op deciding just to issue more tokens. Because the lack of a shortage of tokens for some of the players means the players aren't playing, and therefore you have a downturn caused by the financial sector. And so like that's the backstop role that a central bank has. But if you look at, let's just take a look at from the point of view of an individual bank. So an individual bank, to become a bank, you must show you have assets that exceed your liabilities, substantial assets that exceed your liabilities. And some friends of mine established a bank in recent years in the UK, so I heard a few of their comments about the whole process they had to go through to do this. And then those assets, in effect, when you imagine a bank starting out with no loans, then what it's going to have is all its assets are going to be either reserves or government bonds, preferably government bonds because they yield a higher amount of interest than reserves do, and then they have no liabilities, they have but no income earning assets. So their role is to lend And when they lend, then they create an income-earning asset for themselves and also the matching liability of the deposit that's been created. And they then service that, they maintain their equity by the income flow coming from the loans that they've created. And the higher the gearing they get between their equity and their assets, the more that their assets are in forms of loans rather than reserves, for example. I'm not saying that they lend from loans, reserves to loans, but the more loans you have, the more income earning capacity you have. And that can mean you get to the point where your loans might be, say, 10, 20, 30 times your equity. Now, then you're in trouble. And this is what we saw during the financial crisis, that the temptation for banks is to leave their equity as much as they can to make as large a gain as possible. But what they then expose themselves to is loans going bad. So what they have in terms of practical appearance, they have a set of loans which are classified as as active, valid. Then they have underperforming loans where the interest payments aren't being made, and therefore the interest that isn't being paid is accumulating on the debt. The debt is increasing that way. But then they have bad loans where loans have gone bad, and they've got to take a hit to their equity on that front. So the danger for banks is if they get too highly geared between the amount of loans that the value of loans they've extended and the amount they have as their equity, if too many of those loans get transferred to bad loans, then their equity can go negative. And in fact,
it's two different sorts of money, isn't it? So on the one side, you've got the equivalent of those babysitting coupons, which are the reserves, which are there just for moving money around. And on the other side, you've basically got the equity, the bank equity, and that's got to be able to cover if there is, for example, a run on the bank. Have they got enough money to be able to pay people back? It's not about paying transfers between banks in their own funny money. It is about paying people back in cold hard cash that they put money into the bank in the first place. That's the division, isn't it? Really? Yeah,
and you've got to be, and this is the confusion we've made is that people think the reserves flow into the loans. This is a bit like thinking when you put oil in your car, that then gives you extra miles per gallon. I'm sorry. The goal is to make sure if you're talking electric, old-fashioned gas car, of course, the oil's there to make sure your pistons don't jam. They're not there to make sure the pistons move. And the confusion of reserves with loans, which the conventionals do, and especially bloody Paul Krugman. So not going to give him too many prizes for his nice babysitting analogy.
Which isn't his anyway.
This isn't his anyway. That's true. That confusion is just we don't understand how the economic car moves, and we see this nonsense like bloody Elon Musk's tweet a couple of today on 4 signs that you don't understand, that you can't manage money, and I said the 5th sign is that you post an infographic like this.
I haven't seen that. I need to. So that is so we're recording this on Monday
without having done the accounting first of all. Yeah, I mean, basically thinking the government should be running a deficit, should be saving money. Right. The government should be saving money and should spend less than it gets in. That means the government should be destroying money. That's what it's saying. And going back to the babysitting analogy, even the babysitting analogy would be improvement on what he posted, because with the babysitting analogy, the central collective of the babysitters, we better produce more tokens, let's make them and distribute them. And that then, as you say, increases the solvency of the individuals in the collective, and they can therefore decide to go and have more GDP, which means going out and partying more.
Okay.
Typical for an economist not to understand how a party works.
It's bizarre, isn't it, really? Perhaps they don't get invited to enough of them. I wonder why that would be. So, okay, when we come back then, I want to look more about the impact of managing liquidity and the impact it has on the economy. So, because on the one side, I've been thinking, well, it's good if everyone's got a buffer of cash, but it's not good if that cash isn't being used. So what does that do for the economy? So for businesses or for individuals or for banks. So we'll look at all of that when we come back. It is the debank. By the way, I'm loving the fact that you've gone from being an Elon Musk fanboy to openly criticising him now. The turnaround is enormous, Steve.
Okay, so when he's talking about what he knows about, he makes sense. Criticising money, he's talking through his hat. And the bastard, the guy says, he always comes with the importance of working from first principles. So, Elon, you are not working from first principles and trying to understand money.
But he must.
You want a lesson? Come to me.
But he's an engineer. I thought you wanted engineers to run the economy. And it's Elon Musk. He must know what he's talking about because it's Elon, surely.
Well, an engineer, he could pick up a copy of Minsky and work it out for himself in 10 minutes and go, oh, shit, all that stuff wrong. What are those people talking about that I used to take seriously? That's what he should be doing.
Right. Elon, that's your homework for this week. Okay, when we come back.
Get a copy of Minsky and model the monetary system, and then you might change your infographics.
Right, very good. All right, it's the Debunking Economics podcast with me, Phil Dobbie, and Steve Keen. We are back in just a second.
This is the Debunking Economics podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
So, Steve, we are looking at liquidity this week. We've had the Paul Krugman babysitting coupon analogy, which took us a little way towards understanding it, perhaps. For most people, it's have I got enough cash for my liabilities, isn't it? Have I got enough cash to pay my mortgage this week? Have I got enough to cover the all the household expenditure, any loans I've got? But I mean, but most people, when they think of liquidity, they also think of cash flow, don't they? It's can I get through? So I might have enough money through the year, but have I got enough to get me through the dry months? And if I've got to save for that, then that is money that I have just parked somewhere, which isn't being particularly productive for the economy. So from a public policy point of view, does it make sense that that money is just parked, or should we be finding a way to make sure it's being used in a more advantageous way than just like a lot of money I have sitting around waiting to pay the tax man?
Yeah, and that's exactly the problem. Not the tax man so much, but the fact that people hoard money. And when you hoard money, it isn't a case that you whack it in a tin, though that does happen. It's that you slow down how fast you spend what you have. And that means that on an individual basis, if you look at your expenditure minus your income minus your expenditure, and you see that you have, if you're talking about your dry months there, in the dry months your expenditure exceeds your income because your income has fallen. In those months, your response to that, I'm now my bank account, my cash reserve is falling. Your response to that is to spend less. Now, what that means is you may get to the point where your income once again exceeds your expenditure, and that's great for you. So you start to accumulate cash in your account. But what's happening collectively is the shops that you used to shop at aren't seeing you anymore, and their income has fallen. So at the aggregate level, know that your act of hoarding more of the money supply and circulation doesn't increase the money supply and circulation. So what it means is your act of saving becomes an act of dis-saving for somebody else. And that's actually the point of the cartoon book that people would have seen my marketing company promoting partly ad nauseum, but I think they're working, they're succeeding. Funny money, because I model a hypothetical economy consisting of three Republican rednecks, billionaires in the heart of America, and they decide that they're all going to try to save money. What happens is the economy falls in size. And this is the problem. That's what, again, the incredible importance of Keynes's observation of the paradox of thrift, which people have never really got their heads around. You want money to turn over. Now, if you have factors which mean people spend what they have more slowly, partly because they're trying to accumulate what they're spending with, then you have an economy which is going to fall in size because of the financial system. And that's what central banks are supposed to try to prevent. So you do want to have a means to encourage people to spend in that situation. But the means have to be realistic. And I'm afraid most of what I've seen central banks propose as ways to encourage that a long way from realistic.
Well, is it central banks or is it banks generally? So when I put money aside, well, if it's very short term, I stick it into premium bonds, just in the hope that maybe I'll win this month, which I've won. I won £25 last month. So, there we are.
Hey, well.
And £50 the month before. So it can be done. But many months with nothing at all. Or I put it in the bank. Now, say I put it in the bank and I think, okay, I'm going to earn a bit of interest till I need to pay the tax man on this money. In effect, that is, first of all, it's money that's turning over more slowly. In fact, isn't it money that gets destroyed, in effect, for a while until I pull it out again? Because it's money that
No, it's not being destroyed. I mean, to destroy money, you have to do an act which reduces the liabilities of the banking sector in the aggregate.
Right, but I've got a loan I've got a loan with the bank. I'm not paying off the loan, but I'm putting it back in. Doesn't it have the same impact as sort of paying off a loan?
Hang on a second. Are you paying the loan off at all, or are you just saying you're?
Well, I've got a mortgage, and I put the money into the same bank that the mortgage is with. Well, okay, for the point of this argument, say I've got an offset account for my mortgage. Yeah. So I put it into my mortgage, even though I know I'm going to pull it out again. Then that's money destruction, isn't it? Because I'm basically paying down my loan. So there's
if you're doing anything to reduce your liabilities and reduce the bank's assets, then you have in inverted commas destroyed money. So that is the dilemma I think we face, that we have such. And this is one of the dangers again of a huge level of private debt. We have such a amount of outstanding debt that people's response is to spend more slowly, and so the velocity of money has declined. And one of my favourite data series was actually invented by a colleague of mine, but then discontinued, unfortunately, called Money of Zero Maturity. Which is like a general way of saying what is something which you can use immediately for spending, and that so it's more general than just M1, M2, M3. Okay, so a more sophisticated element. But if you look at the velocity, that velocity figure back in the back in the 1960s, when they backdated the data as far as they could in the 1960s, the velocity of money of zero maturity is roughly 2, meaning that it turned over twice a year. Now you then take a look at the profile when the inflation of the 70s started to fall in, it actually rose to 3.5. So that's quite a dramatic increase in the rate of turnover of that money. But then we had the peak levels of the private debt getting to ridiculous levels starting in the 1980s as well, and it's fallen from 3.5 to just below 1 when they stopped recording the numbers. So that money is turning over half as much. So you need twice as much of it to get the same level of economic activity, and that's back to the babysitters example.
So is liquidity management something that banks should be helping, or we should be helping banks with, but also should banks be helping individuals with, or should we, let them hit these cash flow problems? I mean, if we help them out, if there was a way of saying, well, okay, if you can show that through the year we want to balance out your spending, if we know your cash flow goes up and goes down. That is a conversation I can't have with my bank. They just say, sort it out yourself. You're owning a business, nothing to do with us.
It's something which you want the managers of the system to be aware of, because what we're fundamentally trying to do is to ensure that the financial system enables transactions rather than inhibiting them. And what we've got when people face a liquidity crunch, which is what you're facing in the month of January, and when it's a systemic thing, which is far worse, then in that particular case, people cannot spend, and we have a liquidity crunch, and that means the financial sector disturbs the real economy. And that's been what's happened in every financial crisis throughout history. It's been the financial sector that has caused the crisis. The sole exception of any scale is COVID. That was the nearest thing to the sort of exogenous shock that economists like to model that actually caused a downturn. Otherwise, the downturns have all been through liquidity crunches and solvency issues for the banking system.
But if I've got a liquidity issue, that means I save to try and get around it. And that helps the finance sector, doesn't it?
No. Well, you mean you put money in...
If I go, well, January is going to be pretty bad, so first of all, I tell the kids, no Christmas presents this year because January is always bad, just bad luck that Christmas always falls just before the month of low income. And I've got to pay tax at the end of January. So I start saving September, October, November, December, so I can get through January and a bit of February. So that money, September, October, November, December, isn't going into isn't going into my coffee shop. My crushed avocado and toast every morning. It's going to the bank to save up so I can get through January and February. So the finance sector benefits from that imbalance.
Sort of. I mean, we're talking about you putting deposits into the system. The financial sector benefits when you take on more debt. And one of the problems of this situation is that when you do have a liquidity crisis, you're going to be potentially forced to take on debt because you've got to borrow from the bank to be able to have the money to cover your cash flow deficiency. But B, your willingness to do that is close to zero, because then you have a continuing financial commitment afterwards. And it's this dilemma between cash flow and financial and debt commitments that tends to torture us and ends up in events like the financial crisis.
Talk us through very quickly then the steps for that financial crisis as it relates to liquidity, because it is just a slowdown in demand, isn't it? Because people just don't have enough cash. Or was it being driven from the finance sector? What caused it in the first place?
Well, what it causes is that you have too much. You have a boom caused by too much credit. Credit being a far too large a proportion of total demand. So I guess the neoclassicals can never understand this. I know the kick at Paul Krugman, because they treat credit as being like an interpersonal transaction. And Fisher covered this beautifully in his Booms and Depressions in 1932. He said that a man-to-man debt, and using the language at the time, a man-to-man debt doesn't have any impact on the economy when it's paid or extended, because the fall in spending power of one party is offset by the rise in spending power of the other. And in the aggregate, there's no particular change. But he said it's different with a bank debt. When a bank debt is paid off, the money simply disappears. So Fisher understood the endogeneity of money in the banking sector. Now, what that means on the other side is that credit, when banks extend credit, they create additional spending power. Your spending power is the cash flow you get out of your income earning plus what you borrow from the bank. And then when you spend that money, that it becomes income for the people that you spend it on. So the credit-based demand is a large part of total demand. Now, what happened back in 2008 was that in America's case, it reached 15% of GDP. So it's like an additional 15% of demand over and above that coming out of the sale in goods and services. Then it fell to -5. So we have 20% of GDP turnaround in credit-based demand. And you look back, you find the similar thing in the Great Depression. All the major downturns have negative credit. So that's the causal mechanism. If I want to put a reasoning side behind it, my easiest example is to give a simple example of all the borrowing being done by the firm sector. And then you look at what the income distribution is in a very simple three-class system. So you have income either going to go to the capitalists who borrow the money for investment in firms, I'll call it the firm sector, the workers who are going to get it in wages, or the banks who get it in interest payments. Now, as you have a rising level of investment, firms are borrowing money from the banks, so their interest charges are going up. But they're also causing a boom, which is likely to make wages rise as well as employment rising. So income minus wages minus interest payments. The minus wages bit has got two causal factors in the economy multiplied together. The wage rate times the number of workers. That increases quadratically. You've got a linear increase in the income. The quadratic overrules the linear, and you get lower profit than you expect, and people then stop borrowing money. Credit goes from positive to negative, and you have a crash. So that's getting a bit airy-fairy, but that's the sort of framework that I have to understand how a financial crisis comes about. And it's amplified by the fact that most of the money we borrow is to gamble on asset prices. And so that when an asset price decline, when you get a level of, again, the driving force for asset prices is change in the level of debt. That's credit. So credit gives you your price level. Acceleration of credit gives you a change in your price level, and nothing accelerates forever. So when the acceleration slows down, and that can often be because you've got reached a level of debt to income that people get uncomfortable with, you have a cease of borrowing, and the credit and the asset price rise goes negative. And when the asset price goes negative, then in people's personal balance sheets, their assets are falling, the liabilities are constant. They're afraid of a solvency crash as well as the liquidity crash, and they stop spending as well, and then you have a huge financial crisis.
Right, but this time it's different, isn't it? Because personal liquidity is less of an issue, isn't it? Because if we believe the statistics, and I know that a lot of this will be sitting in the bank accounts, or actually in those assets that you're talking about of the very rich, but supposedly we are saving more. because we got a
We're only saving again. Hang on.
I know. That's why I was, putting a proviso in there that is it savings really, but
the savings. The savings is a record of the creation of money by the government sector.
Right.
Okay, and it's also a record of the amount of money debt being created by banks, because when you borrow money from banks, your savings go up. Why? Because your debt's gone up.
Right.
Okay.
So the amount of money that's sitting in people's bank accounts on aggregate is larger than it was before we went into the pandemic.
And the one positive is that most of that larger came not from a borrowing splurge with the banks, though some of that did happen.
Came from the government.
People were forced to go, and mainly the government spend 20% of GDP, 25% of GDP is the deficit, and bang, that money turned up in people's bank accounts. Wow, we're saving money. No, the government's creating it and it's turning up in your bank account.
Right, but for most people that means, well, I've got more money. So I'm more liquid, and the fact that they haven't been able to spend it has added to that. So, in theory, we are less worried about, as individuals, liquidity now than we have in the past, unless of course we've gone and tied it all up in shares and the share price dives.
And a lot of it did go that way, but okay, that's a large part of this. This is the COVID recovery after the COVID, or the COVID crisis itself, and the recovery after it are the best argument going in favour of fiat money creation.
Yeah.
Because if you take a look at the, and I recommend people to take a look at the St. Louis Fred database, where the vertical bars in any chart will show you the duration of the beginning and ending of each recession, officially recorded recession. And the thinnest bar from 1964, and actually from the Great Depression forward, the thinnest bar is the COVID crisis. And what happened during the COVID crisis, the government created a huge amount of fiat money by having all the spending that was done with the fall in tax receipts as well. There was a huge deficit. That huge deficit, dollar for dollar, turned up in people's bank accounts. We call that saving. I wish we'd grow up and realise that it's not government saving. It's not personal saving. It's government money creation that does that. And what it did was in some ways return us back to the state of the 50s, where people had so much cash in their bank accounts compared to their liabilities and their outgoing that they were freely spending, and you had a booming economy.
Yeah. So why is that not happening now?
Because we have this bunch of neoclassical economists, some of them called Paul Krugman, though he belonged on the other side of this particular argument in the mainstream envelope, who are obsessing about government debt and say we shouldn't create it. Yeah. Government debt creates private assets. Yeah. This is the key, absolutely accounting-based point of MMT. It's got nothing to do with unemployment rates or policy settings. It is simply the accounting that creates money in private bank accounts. Because that money is there, the increase in the amount of cash you've got mean you have more cash in your own account, courtesy of government money creation, than you had beforehand. Therefore, your cash, available cash, it exceeds what you see as your outgoings. You are more likely to spend. Yep. And because you spend, everybody else is spending as well. What's going out of your account is being matched by what's coming back into it by the whole circulation process. So if they understood that, we would have far less financial crises. And it's the lack of understanding of that by mainstream economists that is a major factor why we have financial crises.
So in the babysitters example, people stopped babysitting because there weren't enough vouchers around, because some people had hoarded. So even though there has been a lot of money that has been created by the government, it's not being spread evenly. So if you think that, we all need to have a buffer to repay loans so we can meet our commitments, over those months till revenue picks up again. Rich people, of course, will have big reserves of cash. Like for example, Nadeem Zahawi had no problem at all, not only paying, £3.5 or £4 million to the tax office that he was hoping he was going to get away with. He also had another £1.5 million to be able to cover the fine that was imposed on him as well. So he's obviously fairly liquid to be able to pay out that sort of money just on a whim, because we don't see him selling houses or anything like that. So he's doing all right. So rich people, have big reserves of cash or other assets that can be turned into cash, so they can take on more commitments. They can have bigger loans, for example, because they have that buffer, that liquidity buffer. Poor people have got no cash, so they can't take on loans. And even if all being well, they could meet their commitments, they will have this big fear that what if something goes wrong, because they have such a small buffer, liquidity buffer. And yet we want the poor people to have the money because they spend it faster than rich people spend it. So how do we get over that problem? Because again, they might have a lifestyle that they can afford, but they hit this liquidity problem, and so they need a bigger buffer proportionally to their income.
This is the income distributional aspect of government spending, because government spending overwhelmingly goes on people with low incomes. And this is the other annoying thing about the focus on the government running the surplus obsession that mainstream economists and conventional politicians have acquired from the economists. The poor spend because they have to. Okay, and you're always, if your income is low or you've been through an experience of poverty, and I've had a couple of little briefs, experienced that myself in my own life, in that situation you're always thinking about money because you haven't got it. And therefore you spend less, and you're always trying to make sure you've got something resembling a buffer inside there. You don't want to get caught up in the loan sharks, etc., etc. But that is the people at the bottom end of the spectrum who would spend the money if they had it because they have to spend. They're the ones who are always worrying about money, and the ones at the top of the system who think that they're good money managers don't need to think about it because of the huge buffers they've got. So if you're cutting back on government spending, you're not hitting the rich's spending, you're hitting the poor. You're therefore increasing the liquidity constraints the poor feel and causing less spending, and that's the sort of economy we've ended up in, where the poor can't afford to spend.
But this need for liquidity, I mean, it means that, poor people are spending less because they want to make sure they've got that buffer. The rich people have got that buffer, and they don't care too much, and they can't spend all the money they've got. So I wonder whether actually the easiest way of fixing that problem and getting a more productive economy would be say, well, what are you keeping that buffer for? Oh, a chunk of it is paying your tax. Well, maybe we just increase the tax threshold so you don't have to worry about paying tax. Let's take out those spending commitments so you don't need quite as much of a buffer. That would be a good first step, wouldn't it?
This is partly the issue. Tax, as we know, doesn't fund government spending. It reduces the amount of government money creation. But of course, where the money gets taken out of in terms of tax affects the distribution of income in society. And a large part of being wealthy is avoiding that problem, which your friend who tried to evade $1 million, what was his name again?
Zadim Zahawi. So he's I'm not sure if you've been keeping up on the news here, Steve, but he's the...
No, I try to avoid British news these days.
So he was
he was
the chairman of the Conservative Party who was sacked over the weekend because of tax evasion. So, I mean, some people would say that's fraud. They normally get away with tax evasion. And therefore means that when the government money is taken out of circulation, given how long we've had income tax now, which is about, 70 or 80 years of income tax, the wealthy can afford accountants to work out ways to avoid paying their share. So the burden of removal goes on the middle class and the poor. Yeah.
Now, that is the issue. We have one of the issues we have to get away from. One reason I'm, have some sympathy towards the ideas of transaction taxes as ways of taking money out of circulation rather than income tax. I don't think there's any chance of getting it through, but while you do it using income tax, the result is that the rich can evade it by relocating where their income comes, or classifying their expenditure as related to income earning when it's actually related to buying carpets to decorate your flat number 10. But the poor can't do that, so they're stuck with the literal tax obligations fall on the poor, they don't fall on the rich.
So do you think then, as a public policy objective, it makes sense to say, well, okay, how do we reduce the necessity for this liquidity buffer for people on lower income? Does that so that more cash is getting spent, so that they have a better lifestyle, but also we're seeing money turning over faster in the economy because money which is being saved or put aside is now getting spent. That sort of makes sense, doesn't it?
That's a good macro argument for it, and one of the few things Milton Friedman ever proposed that I have some sympathy for is the idea of a negative income tax. Below a certain level of income, then your tax rate is negative, which is again a form of universal basic income. And one thing I like about an idea of a UBI, pardon my throat getting a bit crogged there. One thing I like about the idea of a UBI is it does free people from that worry about, if I spend, I won't have any cash. If there's a cash flow coming in, which gives you the capacity to spend, and you don't have that same panic effect that means you don't spend, and you therefore have an economy where money turns over more freely rather than being quote unquote hoarded.
So, okay, we'll leave it there. I'm surprised you've not followed up on, or you've not been following the Nadine Zahawi story, because it's a corker. Because, by the way, when he was until the weekend the chairman of the Tory party, but when he was evading tax and was hit with this, whatever it was, 1.5 million fine, which means he was guilty of sin, he was the Chancellor of the Exchequer. So he was the man in charge. I've always been a great fan of Monty Python, but I think saying in the last decade, particularly after I moved to England back in 2014, they couldn't.
Is that
they can't do satire like the real world is right now. It's not a comedy series. It's a documentary about England. It certainly is, isn't it? It goes from bad to worse. Anyway, well, I'll leave it there for now. We'll talk to you back in the studio here again next week. So we'll see you then. Thanks, Steve.
Okay, mate. Bye.
I don't know how you can live in the UK, which Steve is right now, not because of the Zahawi story, because it is all over the news. That's it for this week. I'm Phil Dobby, back again with Steve next week. Thanks for listening in today. Catch you then.
The Debunking Economics Podcast.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, then please share it with your friends, like it on YouTube, and subscribe to this channel.